Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the St. Louis Art Museum. The museum's annual Art in Bloom Festival is virtual again this year, and we're excited to have live and on-demand programs throughout the month of March that celebrate art and flowers. In addition to attending today's program, we hope that you will visit slam.org/bloom to enjoy the many other offerings. Also, museum members should check their email for a link to the member-exclusive Art in Bloom virtual tour. This year's Art in Bloom is offered with presenting sponsorship from Dowd Bennett. Additional sponsorship support is provided by Bunge, KPMG, Neiman Marcus, and Tarleton. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's program, The Flowering of Fashion in Plant-Obsessed Europe, we are joined with Genevieve Cortinovis, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Assistant Curator of Decorative Arts and Design. Thank you so much for being here, Jenny.
There I am. Hi. So I'm really thrilled to be here, to have the opportunity to speak with you about a topic which, as a decorative arts historian, I cannot and honestly would not want to escape: flowers. And I have to say, St. Louis is beautiful, about 65 degrees right now with blue skies. And so I'm definitely feeling the spring bug. So I start with this tantalizing image of truly one of the most extraordinary garments to have survived the 18th century, an English court mantua from 1744, embroidered all over in botanically accurate flowers: jasmine, morning glory, peonies, poppies, cornflowers, and carnations. Any embroiderers out there will recognize the technique for creating the polychrome flowers as satin stitch. It's shading achieved by laying successive values of the same color next to one another. It is literally painting with a needle. It can be done with relatively simple tools, a needle and thread. For the next 40 minutes, we'll explore how these same lifelike flowers were realized in woven silk through a dizzyingly complex process that would involve, from its design to manufacture to consumption, hundreds of people across the globe. This will be a show in 5 acts, so to speak. First, we'll dive into the museum's somewhat quirky, but also very revealing collection of floral dress silks. We'll examine what survives, in what state, how, and why. Then we will look at 2 major European centers of silk textile production: Lyon, France, and Spitalfields, England, considering the influence of botany, including scientific principles of close observation, the explosion of the print industry, and the role of colonialism and empire in bringing new plans and design ideas to European designers and manufacturers. Finally, we'll consider how these fabrics made their way across Europe to the Americas, looking at 2 case studies, one in Boston, Massachusetts, and another in Lima, Peru. Since these objects are light sensitive, they live primarily in the archival boxes and flat shelves in our art storage facilities. However, many have been featured in recent Gallery 100 exhibitions, and they will be featured in future rotations in our decorative arts galleries. So, collections at the St. Louis Art Museum. What kind of European silks are in SLAM's collections? And the short answer here is mostly 18th century dress silks featuring floral patterns. Convenient for this talk, I have to say. This shows a collecting bias towards the most luxurious textiles with unique and visually complex patterns and construction. More ordinary textiles, plain and striped silks, for instance, accounted for the majority of silk textiles produced in Europe's major weaving centers. However, they tend not to be what survives. SLAM does not actively collect fashion, but we do have a few examples of 18th century women's dresses, I have to say substantially altered over the course of their lives. So the one on the left here, this wonderful kind of mauve dress, was given to us by Mrs. Max Beckmann, Kwappi Beckmann, and it was owned probably by her father, who was a society painter in Munich, and may have used it as a kind of prop in some of his paintings. And then we have this wonderful dress, robe à l'anglaise, that was given to us by Mrs. Daniel K. Catlin, Gertrude Catlin. And this dress actually descended in her family from when it was made probably in Boston around 1741. We also have fragments of dresses, like these weighted sleeves. I would say their very survival is a testament to the great material and sentimental value of floral silks. We have liturgical investments which incorporate dress silks. Some probably repurposed from previous garments. Sometimes women, for instance, would give their trousseau or use dresses to the church, and others made from directly commissioned dress silks. So a church might commission a dress silk and then create a whole set of liturgical vestments with that. We have panels of dress silk sewn together to create large hangings and covers, and this was probably done in the 19th century. And sometimes you can see these sort of large covers strewn over pianos or beds in sort of late 19th and early 20th century interiors. We also have many panels of dress silks completely disassembled from garments that were probably, but perhaps not exclusively, women's dresses. So floral silks were worn by men as well as women, often in the form of banyans or informal robes and waistcoats. But we're going to focus on women's fashion for the subject of this talk. In the 1700s, silk designs changed seasonally. This seasonal cycle, which constantly demanded new patterns and fresh design ideas, was developed in the late 17th century by King Louis XIV of France and his famous minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Economically motivated, it included initiatives to bring all levels of silk manufacturing to France, particularly Lyon: sericulture, weaving, and design. And this reminds us that supply chain kind of paranoia and issues are nothing new. This was something that they also thought about in the 17th century. And their aim was really to make France the center of silk design and the main exporter of figured silks. This seasonal development is critical because in the 18th century, the fashion silhouette changed slowly and very little. So textiles became a central marker of changing taste and status. And these panels show you some important touch points in the stylistic development of European silk design, and that's precisely why we acquired them as a museum. So we have from so-called bizarre silks of the 1700s to lace pattern silks of the 1720s to large-scale blossoms in the 1730s and 1740s to bouquets of flowers underlaid with meanders of fur and ribbons, and finally to stripes. These silks were woven on a draw loom, which is a complex loom which had two devices for shedding or raising the warp threads in groups as required by the pattern. Setting up a pattern on a draw loom took more than a month, and weaving was slow. About a yard a day was typical. For each line of a design, a weaver had to open the shed by pressing his, or more rarely her, foot on a treadle, this kind of pedals at the bottom, while the draw boy or girl pulled on the assigned lashes to lift the warp threads called for by the design. For the most part, these textiles are brocaded, meaning they have polychrome supplementary weft threads, which you can see in the image here. I'm pointing to some of the brocading shuttles here. I'm showing you here the back and the front of one of the textiles, so you can appreciate how much silk was needed to create these delicate, complex designs, and the sort of the floating silk wefts in the back as well. Only the wealthy and privileged wore silk garments in the 18th century, with the most sumptuous textiles reserved for the court and the aristocracy. So here are some portraits of four ladies wearing their finest figured silks, or perhaps not their finest, but in some of their cases, but some very fine silks nonetheless. So on the upper left, you have a portrait of Victoire of France, who was King Louis XV's daughter, Miss Dixie, an English aristocrat, Rosa de Salazar, a Peruvian Spanish noble, and Anne Shippen William, the wife of a Philadelphia merchant. And she is actually the subject of a book, which I highly recommend if you're interested in this subject, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World by Zara Anaslassen. And it's a really fantastic account of her life and also the life of a designer who we'll explore in just a little bit. There was also a lively secondhand market for silk garments. So servants of the wealthy often received garments as payment in kind or hand-me-downs, selling them on the secondhand market as they made their way across many levels of society. Very few people owned extensive wardrobes, and so most middle-class people, for example, a master weaver's wife, owned just a few fine dresses. Major weaving centers like Lyon and Spitalfields produced a huge range of silks, from the simplest, solid, plain woven silks to the most elaborate brocaded silks with gold and silver wrapped threads, seen in the court costumes of Europe's aristocracy and royalty. These textiles were often picked and burned for their precious metals, and so they do not survive in great numbers, but we actually have a few in the collection. And here you can see a detail of that large cover that I showed you earlier, with these wonderful sparkling gold and silver threads. And on the right, you can see a detail of the liturgical vestment that I showed earlier, also showing the inclusion of silver and gold or metal wrapped threads. Silk textiles could also incorporate sumptuous, if less expensive materials like chenille, a plush yarn, kind of like a velvet, to create pattern and texture. And here you can see this little burgundy flower has a kind of is made from chenille and has this wonderful texture. Other textiles achieved drama by using different color warp and weft threads. Sometimes these are called shot fabrics. So the textile appears to change color depending on the light. So this is actually the same textile. In certain lights, the base color looks green, and others it looks burgundy or brown, and has a really wonderful effect. Turning brambles into flowers in Lyon, France. The story of who and how the concept of complex shading was first introduced into woven textiles in the 1730s has been the subject of debate amongst textile historians for the past 20 years. It's now generally regarded as a stylistic change rather than a technical one, influenced by painting techniques of light and shading. One of the most important surviving accounts of the silk industry in Lyon, Le Dessinateur, written by Nicolas Joubert d'Ibergy in 1765, credits the Lyon-based designer and entrepreneur Jean Ravel for the innovation, and he's credited by other contemporaries as well. Textiles like this one, attributed to Ravel from the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, show the use of a technique called point rentré, where different colors, often demi-teintes or shades of the same color, interlocked side by side, creating the illusion of three dimensions, as in a painting. While these silks sometimes included elements of architecture, they are overwhelmingly dominated by large-scale flowers. This focus on representations of large, lifelike blossoms called for formal training, not dissimilar to the kind undergone by fine artists. In the early 18th century, most French silk designers went to Paris for their education, working in the studio of the city's decorative painters like Louis Tessier, whose work you can see right here. This is actually in Sam's collection, this wonderful still life of flowers. Paris was also the primary market for Lyonnais silks and was a critical link in the distribution of luxury figured textiles. In one of several moves to enhance the city's reputation as a place of not only technical and industrial, but also artistic and cultural prominence, Lyon established its own school of design in 1756. Regardless of where they trained, prospective designers were thoroughly schooled in not only figure drawing, but critically flower drawing and bottony. And Joubert describes his own education under the famed flower painter Jean-Jacques Bachelier in Paris in his text Le Dessinateur. And he says, and I quote, "I will always remember with pleasure the debt which I have to my teacher, who for the 8 months that I drew under him at the academy made me understand the anatomy of a plant before I drew it. It is by him alone that I have heard of the division of a flower into 7 parts, namely the root, the stem, the leaves, the calyx, the pistil, the petals, and the stamens. He often made me break them down after having drawn them, to let me know their birth, junction, growth, development, form, and perfection. So I will say it again, one cannot draw too much from nature and for too long. And I even say that a course in botany would be as necessary for a floral designer as a course in anatomy is for a painter." So here on the left is a self-portrait of the famed silk designer Philippe de La Salle with the tools of his trade. Behind him is a landscape painting and a statue of Flora, the Roman goddess of flowering plants. At his drawing desk, he holds a sprig of flowers lifted from a large basket of blooms. Through his portrait, he clearly emphasized his understanding of the natural world and his mastery in the representation of flowers as a critical aspect of his fame and marketability as a designer. So really understanding this botanical the nature of flowers and the science of flowers was critically important to one success as a designer in Lyon. In the middle of the 18th century, about half of Lyon's 400 manufacturers produced figured as opposed to plain silks. These firms had to be well financed, capable of buying raw materials, which included hand-dyed silk yarns, gold and silver wrapped threads, and designs. They had to be able to pay master and journeyman weavers on a piece rate, and they had to be able to negotiate markets outside the city. So this was a pretty serious enterprise that required lots of capital. Today, silks and museum collections like this one and ours are dated and attributed to Lyon using designs that survive in museum and industry collections. And this one here is by L. Galli-Gallien et Comte, and it's a point paper plan or a technical drawing that facilitated the translation of a design onto a loom. So freehand sketches preceded these plans, and only those accepted by a manufacturer would be transcribed, often by a specialist, a metteur en carte, onto this gridded paper. For all of Joubert's Enlightenment-influenced talk of strict botanical study, silk designers were heavily influenced by other decorative genres, and their floral designs were often highly inventive. In addition to representing local flowers like roses and carnations, they were inspired by the flowers and floral designs of Asia, in particular, brought to Europe and American markets via decorative arts like ceramics and other kinds of textiles. You might compare this wonderful brocaded silk. So this is a detail from the dress that I showed earlier that was owned by Max Beckmann's wife, Bothy's father. And this has these wonderful craggy green branches punctuated with kind of small multicolored blossoms of orange, blue, pink, and yellow. And you could compare it to this one, to one of Lyon-based born artists and designers, Jean Piment's prints, and I quote, showing Chinese subjects used in painted silks. This illustration was published by Robert Serre in the famous English source for professional and amateur designers alike, The Lady's Art of Japanning. Piment himself, who as I mentioned was born in Lyon, never traveled to Asia himself, but rather interpreted and romanticized a variety of European and Asian design sources, melding them into a romantic and exoticized decorative style called chinoiserie. So now we'll head across the English Channel to one of France's major competitors in the silk production industry, and this was Spitalfields, England. And we'll talk about one of the most famous designers to come from Spitalfields, Anna Maria Garthwaite, her involvement in some of London's naturalists. So a neighborhood in East London, or east of London, kind of depending on the time period, called Spitalfields, was the capital of silk weaving in England. And as I mentioned, one of the most famous designers known today working there in the 18th century was a woman named Anna Maria Garthwaite. Born in 1689 or 90, Garthwaite was the daughter of Reverend Ephraim Garthwaite of Grantham, Lincolnshire, and his wife, Rejoice Hansted. Why she became a designer or where she learned to draw remains somewhat of a mystery. She came from a well-connected family, never married, and launched her design career late in life in her 40s. She is sometimes credited as the first English designer to use Jean Revel's technique of point rentré, and is known today for her lively, botanically accurate designs. She was an energetic freelancer, producing some 80 designs a year. Her success lay both in understanding fabric construction and the weaving process, and her ability to translate lifelike flowers into woven silks. For a woman of some notoriety, it is surprising that few documents about her life survive, leaving scholars to speculate about her potential writings and contemporary accounts of her career. So some think that she is the author of this article on the laboratory, where she talks about every season of the year produces plants, flowers, and shrubs that afford greater varieties than we are able to imitate. So Garthwaite's work is known today thanks to a large collection of her surviving designs at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. In 2016, Slam acquired a panel of, and I quote, sky blue silk damask designed by her in 1752. It was identified as her work thanks to a corresponding watercolor design at the V&A. The Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Abegg Museum in Switzerland both have panels of a corresponding silk, likely disassembled from an open robe of sky blue silk that was purchased at Sotheby's in London in 1993. So this attests to the fact that oftentimes these dresses were disassembled later for a dealer market Oftentimes their bodices were damaged, or they had been, as in the case of this one, altered so many times over the course of their lives that they were no longer as interesting to fashion scholars as complete garments. In the upper section of the watercolor at the right, you can see the name M. Sabatier. So most silk designs in the 18th century feature, rather than feature the name of the person who commissioned or purchased the design rather than the designer. Sabatier is a weaver who actually lived on the same block as Garthwaite in Spitalfields. Garthwaite sold her designs to master weavers in the flowered branch of the Weavers' Company, it's the guild, who were mostly of French descent, like Sabatier. Called Huguenots, they were French Protestants who fled persecution in France, mostly for England, the Netherlands, and Germany, especially after the 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which had guaranteed kind of limited rights to French Protestants. Although they made up a small portion of all of the weavers in London, they are disproportionately master weavers of flowered silks, and they became sort of synonymous with the Spitalfields neighborhood. One of the most interesting aspects of this design is Garthwaite's ability to convey a botanically specific flower using only 2 colors. Some interpretive license is necessary when identifying flowers and silks, I will give you that. And while one scholar has suggested the buds and blossoms of this particular design are hops, I think it's more likely a member of the hibiscus family, possibly ochra. So you might compare Garthwaite's design to this exquisite watercolor from 1702 by prominent Swiss German botanical illustrator Maria Sibylla Merian. The ribbed petals and scalloped base, serrated leaves, and distinctive buds in various states of growth appear in both designs. In addition to working as an artist engraver, Merian was also an embroiderer. One of her earliest books featured illustrations of flowers that could be used as a model for embellishing textiles, either through embroidery or painting. Merian's illustrations were known to have circulated amongst London's community of naturalists in the 18th century and could have been seen by Garthwaite. Garthwaite introduced a number of non-native plants into her designs early in her career, further suggesting she had access to botanical illustrations, as I mentioned, and entree into botanical gardens like Mill Hill or the Chelsea Physic Garden, seen here in an illustrated map from 1751. Garthwaite's brother-in-law, Edward Bacon, had a brother, Vincent, who worked as an apothecary and surgeon in Spitalfields and was a prominent naturalist of his day. She may have studied under silk designers like Joseph Dandridge, who was also a noted naturalist and whose designs survive at the V&A. While she was not part of the Apothecary Guild herself, she would have had access to, for instance, the Chelsea Physic Garden through these connections. At the time, the garden was run by the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, and through ties to the Leiden Seed Bank and access to North American plant imports, it was one of the most botanically diverse gardens in the world. Curated by the noted botanist Philip Miller, the garden included greenhouses, where Garthwaite, really regardless of the season, may have had a chance to sketch, for instance, a flowering hibiscus. While the blue damask is the only silk in Sam's collection designed by Garthwaite, we have several that strongly correspond to her designs in the V&A and can be roughly accurately dated by comparison. In addition to close observation through illustrations, young silk designers learned their craft by copying existing silks and collecting designs if they could. And so competition was fierce, and it's probably not surprising to see silks that strongly resemble each other by different hands. Typical for the mid-1740s, a period of high naturalism in English silk, rather than arranged in tight bouquets like some of the earlier French silks we saw, the flowers on this silk appear to have been picked and strewn across the surface of the design. They are full of identifiable flowers, many that Garthwaite favored, ordinary garden plants like honeysuckle, holly, roses, morning glory, and auricula, and some exotics or non-native species. And I show you here a dress, an image or a drawing in the V&A that corresponds to this wonderful silk textile in our collection, and a dress also that you can see how the textile may have been featured in a kind of fashionable garment of the day. Comparing a few flowers to illustrations printed in Robert Sayre's The Florist, a sort of 18th century coloring book in the collection of the Missouri Botanical Garden, we can speculate as to their potential source or inspiration. So are these buff and pink star-shaped flowers, perhaps almond blossoms? The distinctive clusters of tiny pink and blue flowers blooming from the central stem, perhaps of a guelder rose, or also called viburnum, or possibly auricula. This exquisite English silk with a complex pattern ground and scrolling ribbon includes tulips, roses, morning glory, and holly. So you can see here some of them quite obvious here, especially the rosebuds and the tulips. It was also likely disassembled, that panel, from a dress that may have looked something like this one, worn by Miss Dixie. Here she is pictured with her straw bergère, or shepherdess hat, one glove off. Though dressed in her finest silk, it appears as if she has just returned from a daytime walk, perhaps in the landscape pictured behind her, or in a garden. Observing, recording, and studying plants was considered an admirable pursuit for young English ladies, and their choice of textiles could express their enthusiasm for certain flowers or even their skill or interest in botany, which leaves us to speculate as to the interests of Miss Dixie. While she may never have left England, Dixie's dress, fashioned from raw silk cultivated in Italy, China, and or North America, because England did not have its own industry of sericulture, and featuring flowers from across the globe and her own backyard, situates her in a complex network of trade and colonial ambition, which we'll explore next. So the American colonies were an important market for English silk producers in the 18th century. By 1761, English silk exports to the American colonies reached a peak, valuing some 233,000 pounds. And you can compare that to a value of 33,000 pounds exported to Ireland and 10,000 pounds exported to individual European nations, like Sweden, for instance. It seems the majority of silks exported to the colonies were half silks. So that's silk and wool or silk and linen blends. However, figured brocaded silks with long American provenance surviving in US collections attest to the presence of the highest quality dress silks in the present day US. Many of the extant dresses and panels of silks are associated with merchant families. However, this dress is Spitalfield silk and by tradition descended in the Mascarene and Perkins family of Boston, and in Slam's collection, as I mentioned earlier, is an interesting exception to that rule. It was given to Slam in 1951 by Gertrude Loring Hamlin Catlin and was said to have been owned by her great-great-grandmother or possibly her great-great-aunt, Elizabeth Mascarene, or Joanna Mascarene. The date of the silk, which we'll address in a minute, and the marriage dates of the two brothers, Thomas in 1741 and James in 1744, respectively, suggest it may have been a wedding dress. And thanks to a letter from Jean-Paul Mascarene to his daughter, Joanna, on June 16, 1741, and the Mascarene family papers, we know that Joanna received a large inheritance from her grandmother around the same time the dress was made. And writing from Nova Scotia, where he was governor at the time, the French-born officer in the British Army advises his daughter to, and I quote, lay up what you can of that yearly income of 55 pounds to serve for extra expenses of your fitting out when your time comes to be married. And so it's not nothing new that the parents remind their children to save their money for future expenses. Before Gertrude Catlin gave her dress to Slam, her sisters gave a large panel of the same fabric, possibly from the dismantled sack back or petticoat of the dress, to the MFA Boston. I show it to you here on the left. It's an easy way to see the design. Thanks to designs preserved in the DNA, it's possible to date the silk. So here you can see a comparison with a very similar design by Garthwaite from 1741. This is just before her designs reached their peak naturalism. It would have been natural for the Bostonian sisters to choose such a silk. First, they were Huguenots themselves. Their father, Jean-Paul, fled France as a child after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. He became a naturalized British citizen, and his family remained loyalists during the American Revolution. So choosing an English silk, possibly made by Huguenot weavers, would have been understood as a political statement, their dedication to an ever-expanding Protestant empire in which they were welcomed. This dress began its life as a robe à la française with pleated folds that flowed down the back. In the 1770s, it was altered into a gown with a fitted bodice, becoming a robe à l'anglaise. At some point, the original stomacher, a removable triangular panel that covered the stomach and chest, was lost. And finally, for a costume party around 1900, the matching petticoat was removed and the skirt was hemmed and tied up with swags. And this is, again, very typical in the life of a dress. To get a sense of its original state, you could compare it to one made a few years earlier, also of Spitalfield silk, and by family tradition worn for a 1740 Boston wedding. And this is in the collection of the MFA. Well, a good comparison structurally, I mentioned, you could argue the masquerade dress is more typically English with its pale rather than deep brown. The use of light colored backgrounds, which you don't really see in France, for instance, is proposed to have been influenced by either the white kind of paper of botanical illustrations, but also Indian textiles like chintz, printed and painted cottons. These lightweight, colorful cotton fabrics introduced novel flowers and patterns to European audiences, while also adapting aspects of European silk design. So here on the right, you see a wonderful chintz curtain that actually partially imitates European lace pattern silks of the 1720s. And in the center, you see a detail of a fantastic imported Palampour in our collection. And I think you can see some of the similarities of the way that the branches kind of intersect and overlap, and some of the vibrance and size of the flowers. I'm going to take the opportunity right now to plug a show that is coming to SLAM in the fall. Coming here in October is Chintz, the cloth that changed the world. And this is from the Royal Ontario Museum and will feature a fantastic, mind-blowingly beautiful collection of chintz textiles. So these are made in India for export around the globe. And this is a really fascinating look at this kind of global world of exchange and textiles. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and it actually even comes to the present day. So Act 5, French silks and colonial Lima. So at the same time that the North American English colonies became a major market for Spitalfield silks, cosmopolitan cities in South and Central America were awash in French silks. Lima, where this portrait was painted, was the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru from 1532 to 1824. So thanks to its silver mines, the Lima elites were arguably some of the richest people in the world. And here you have an account. They all greatly affect fine cloths. And it may be said without exaggeration that the finest stuffs made in countries where industry is always inventing something new are more generally seen at Lima than any other place. Rosa de Salazar y Gavino, her dress really caught my attention because of its similarities to several French silks from the same period in SLAM's collection. For instance, the pink ground and tight petals of flowers interspersed with delicate floral garlands of this silk from the late 1760s. It really evokes those on her open robe. Salazar wears what became an international style dress in the mid-18th century, and it's the same style that we saw in the Spitalfield's dress in its original state. So this is an open robe with a square neck, secured at the chest with a pinned stomacher and worn of a petticoat. Usually a matching fabric. With tight sleeves that flare into layers of lace, its construction is not different, as I mentioned, from Joanna's original gown, worn some 4,000 miles away, or this one worn by the Spanish noble, the Duchess of Mendicelli, north of Madrid. And again, in a very similar silk. According to scholars like James Middleton, Rosa's open robe was the exception rather than the norm amongst elite women in the Spanish American colonies. The more typical garment, especially in Mexico, would have been a robe a la Española, in the Spanish style, with a separate jacket and skirt. A cassock with a peplum and a skirt like this one you might see pictured on the young Maria Ana Gertrudis, the daughter of the painter Miguel Cabrera. This portrait captures the young woman just as she is about to enter the Capuchin convent. The striped and flowered silk of her ensemble has much in common stylistically with SLAM's French silk, though it actually could have come from any number of places, including Mexico, which had its own silk weaving industry, though it does not seem as specialized in floral silks, and China. By 1570, Spain had developed its own trade relationship with China through the port of Manila in the Philippines. Fine brocaded, painted, and embroidered silks, financed by gold and silver mined in the Spanish American colonies, made their way to Europe through Mexico and South America. Cities like Lima and Mexico City were major entrepôts for Asian goods, and its inhabitants, like those actually in Boston and Philadelphia, would have had more options than their European counterparts, whose choices were somewhat limited by stricter import laws. So while France and England were sort of the centers of silk design and botanical study, gathering specimens and luring clients from across their vast trade empires, the Americans were hardly a fashion backwater, but rather a site of really inspiring cross-pollination. But as taste changed to favor plain silks in the later part of the 18th century, and revolution swept Europe and the Americas, the demand for luxury figured silks declined. Luscious blooms did appear once again on textiles in the 19th century. However, these were realized on mechanized power looms, often with synthetic dyes. And lucky for us, they would have been accessible to a much larger swath of fashion conscious consumers. And they were in the 19th century still, as I would argue, equally botanically obsessed. And so these flowers do appear again, but for more of us to enjoy, our ancestors to enjoy perhaps. So with that, I will say thank you and happy spring, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jenny. That was lovely. We do have a few questions, and others, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them in. The first, so someone has asked, you mentioned that Garthwaite's patterns often included common flowers that she liked. How often did fashions of the day dictate which kinds of flowers were featured in textiles, for example, exotics or rare blooms? Or rather, were the designers the ones creating the trends? So I guess which came first, the popularity of a type of flower or the flowers that designers chose?
That's a really, really good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that necessarily. There are certainly these publications like Robert Sayers, The Florist, and there are many more. And sometimes these botanical illustrations, which made their way around, may have somewhat dictated which flowers were the most popular for designers, because that is what they had access to through this print culture. And although people like Anna Maria Garthwaite or Philippe de la Salle would have had access to, botanical gardens, your average embroiderer at home might not have. So, and they might have been looking to the florists or the ladies' art of Japanning or that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's a good question. You oftentimes hear that the kind of typical florist flowers of the 18th century, or the favorite florist flowers, were roses and carnations in particular. But then you do see all these non-native flowers also. So that's a very good question.
This one is a little bit more specific of a technical term. What is Chanel made of?
Oh, chenille. Yeah.
Chenille, sorry.
So it's actually, I think, a technique. I believe it is actually silk, but the technique for creating the silk thread makes it that kind of fuzzy, gives it that kind of fuzzy texture. Yeah, and I think it actually is technically, I don't want to actually say that for sure because I'm not, I might have to double check that, but it is really the technique of kind of almost like unwinding it that creates that fuzzy texture.
Okay. So it's not maybe what it's made of, it's how it's made.
I believe you could make it with other things perhaps besides silk, although in this case I think it is made out of silk.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, if anyone else has questions, please type them in. In the meantime, I will ask, oh, never mind, one has come in, so I will ask that question. Were garments ever created with particular flowers intended to send a message or convey a feeling or emotional quality, for example, protest, loyalty, etc.? Or were floral motifs mainly selected simply for their color and beauty?
That's a good question. So there are accounts of women wearing specific textiles to communicate their allegiance. There's one in particular, I want to say it's the Mayor of London's daughter, that where she's wearing hops, I believe, in order to kind of they made their money in the brewing industry or conveying support for brewers. So I think that there is there are moments when textiles and specific flowers mean specific things, and other times I think they just are because they're beautiful, or possibly you're wearing flowers that are not native, and so you're perhaps showing your connection to a larger world, or to trading ties, perhaps. So there are some instances that have been recorded of wearers using textiles as a kind of means of communication very specifically.
Okay. Was there any overlap between the floral chintz printing industry and the floral woven silks industry? Were there shared floral designs between the two material production methods, in other words?
Yes, there were for sure. And some designers actually worked as so textile designers and as designers of printed cottons. So um, you'll definitely see designs that transfer from chintz to silk and back again for sure. And particularly by the later part of the 18th century, you see designers work in kind of both media, even though they are, as we said, very different. Something that's interesting with designers for woven silks is they had to have this kind of specialized knowledge of weaving in this very complicated loom. Otherwise, their designs might become completely elongated or really out of proportion, and would not translate well to these woven silks. So there's kind of specialized technical knowledge as well.
Um, Sort of along those lines, do you know how long, roughly how long did it take to make one of these gowns? If you had to
Well,
guess.
I guess if a yard is considered a good progress, it could take a while. Many weeks theoretically. The mantle makers, the actual stitchers of the garments, that might have taken less time, and they were probably the least or the sort of they received the least compensation. So it was really the silk fabrics themselves where all of the money was spent, for instance.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I actually thought had this same question when you spoke of this. Someone said, "How much metal could you get from burning a single dress?" When you were talking about those metal threads.
Yeah. Well, they were picked and burned pretty frequently. There's a technique I think called paquillage. It was a little like little tools that you would actually use to kind of unpick these metal threads. It was a pursuit um,
Wow.
that ladies practiced in the 18th century. So I don't know how much money you might get back, to be honest. But I guess enough that it made it, and perhaps too also after a garment had been worn and faded, or maybe the silk was shredding, maybe it just made sense to kind of repurpose what could be repurposed. Um, but yeah, it seems like a painstaking process. I mean, it'd be easier to burn it, obviously, than and to
Right,
pick
take
apart each.
all that to
Yeah,
get like a handful of
exactly.
metal, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think so. This might be one of our last questions. How might this have influenced the wallpaper industry?
Well, that's interesting. So certainly in when it came to Chinese wallpaper that was imported into Europe, painted silk wallpaper, painted uh, uh, paper as well. That actually had a lot of overlap with the silk industry to some degree. I think you see it more. So Chinese wallpapers, for instance, really influenced the look of palanquins of the day. So those were these large scale bed covers that were imported from Asia, particularly India. And as the towards the end of the century, they start to get more, their branches and leaves start to get more attenuated, and that seemed to be kind of influence from the Chinese wallpaper industry. Those were used as for interior furnishings, not so much for dresses, but you can see that kind of attenuation in other kinds of printed textiles of the day. In Europe, I don't know about the connections as well, but the connection between Chinese wallpapers and particularly Indian chintzes has been well documented.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, all right, well, this will be our last question. And actually, so if someone has asked if you could mention again, when does the Chintz exhibition open? I don't know if we have a set date, but if you could
It opens in
give that plug
October.
again.
Yeah, it opens in October. It is again, it's coming from the Royal Ontario Museum, and it's going to be really, really special. They have one of the best collections of chintz in the world. And this exhibition unfortunately opened during the pandemic and then had to close and reopen and close. And many people didn't get to see it because of that. So I'm hoping we'll get a good crowd in St. Louis. So it's curated by Philip Hu, and I'm helping him as well. And it has Indian textiles made not just for the European market, but for the world, really. So it's going to show this kind of dynamic industry, and the textiles themselves are really just stunningly beautiful. So I definitely encourage everybody to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny. This has been wonderful and a wonderful way to continue our Art and Bloom programming. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. If you'd like, register to join us this Friday to hear a conversation between curator Hannah Clem and artist Oscar Murillo about his current exhibition that will be on view starting this weekend. Be sure to check slam.org/events to register for that program and more. And again, as a reminder for Art and Bloom programming, go ahead and go to slam.org/bloom. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.